I know that you guys have had a long day, but I'm here to wrap it up. My name's Natalie Frick, and I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And as Lisa said, I'm going to talk about demand flexibility as a utility system resource using grid interactive efficient buildings. And I'm actually going to do my first poll question right off the bat. So Carrie, I think you're the one who are administrating the poll. Can you put our first question up? Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. We're getting some responses. It is after 5 p.m. on the East Coast, so we're hoping we didn't lose too many people. We still have 30 people online, so we're just approaching 50% of responses, so I think we'll close it.
Okay, good. So we have some people who know a lot, or some are a little, and half of the people who don't know too much at all about it, which is good because I have lots of information to share about it. So if we can go on to my next slide. I just have my agenda of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to start off with demand flexibility and grid interactive efficient buildings. And I have this definition, both these definitions later on in the presentation, but I just want to give them to you now. So a grid interactive efficient building is an efficient building that uses smart technologies and on-site distributed energy resources to provide demand flexibility. And demand flexibility is the capability of a distributed energy resource to adjust demand profiles across different timescales. So as I said, I'll show those slides again later on a slide, but I just wanted to provide them up front since I'm going to start using those terms right off the bat. So I'll start off talking about demand flexibility and grid interactive efficient buildings, and then I'll move to talking about valuation of demand flexibility and electricity planning. I'll cover current methods and challenges to them, and also offer a few considerations for improving valuation methods. And then I'll go on to assessing demand flexibility performance. And I'll talk about metrics there and the importance of assessing performance. And then I'll wrap up with identifying some opportunities for states to advance demand flexibility. And I want to thank Lisa Schwartz and Tom Ekman and Steve Schiller, who are some of my colleagues at Berkeley Lab, for their contributions to this presentation. So it looks like we may not be advancing the slides, but I'll keep moving along in the interest of time. This next slide, I have a list of some of the proceedings and requirements that I'm aware of in southeastern states, and I put an asterisk in the title because I'm sure there's more than what I am aware of. And you know, the moral of the slide is that there's many states that are considering the role of storage and demand response, which are resources that improve demand flexibility. And there's also many proceedings or requirements in states around renewable energy and transportation electrification, net metering, and community solar, which are all resources that are going to increase the need for demand flexibility on the grid. And then several states in the Southeast are looking at how to value distributed resources. And many states have existing efficiency requirements, including peak load reduction goals. So if we can go on to slide 4 now. Perfect, thanks. So as I alluded to a little bit on the last slide, the electricity system is changing, and this requires changes in grid operations and more consideration of loads as a flexible resource. There's increasing amounts of variable renewable energy in the Southeast, and it's expected to continue to grow. This bar chart at the bottom of the slide is from EIA, the Electricity Information Administration, and it shows their estimates of small-scale solar in the Southeast, and the x-axis is years, and the y-axis is gigawatt hours, and each one of the colors is a different southeastern state. Other resources are also growing, as I mentioned, such as electric vehicle adoption and demand response and storage. But okay, so there's lots of DERs, but why do we care about buildings? Buildings aren't typically thought of as a flexible resource, but they account for about 75% of electricity consumption and at least that much of peak demand in some areas of the country. And buildings have many adjustable or flexible loads, and they represent the largest source of demand flexibility. Slide 5, please. So this slide has my definitions, or not my definitions, the Department of Energy and the definitions that we've come to define or come to use for grid interactive efficient buildings and demand flexibility, and also how we're defining distributed energy resources and smart technologies, which are also referenced in those grid interactive efficient building and demand flexibility definitions. I have this image on the slide on the right side that is an example of a commercial grid interactive efficient building and some of its characteristics. And it has different technology options than just an efficient building, like smart technologies like advanced sensors and controls, data analytics that can manage distributed energy resources and adjust demand profiles. And there's more of a focus on technology interaction and interoperability and integration of technologies that are outside of the building too, such as rooftop PV and EV charging. Slide 6, please. Thanks. So now that we know what grid interactive efficient buildings are, how can we use them? Energy efficiency and demand flexibility are demand-side management strategies that manage building loads. And efficiency reduces energy while providing the same or improved level of building function. And then there's 4 different modes of demand flexibility, which are shedding, shifting, modulating, and generating. So shedding is the ability to reduce electricity use for a short period of time and typically on short notice. Shifting is the ability to change the timing of electricity use. In some situations, a shift could lead to changing the amount of electricity that's consumed. And it could also result in more electricity being used during less expensive time periods and using storage either through thermal, through the building, or through a battery when electricity prices are more expensive. Modulate is the ability to balance power supply and demand or reactive power draw and supply autonomously in response to a signal from the grid. And generate is the ability to generate electricity for on-site consumption and also dispatch electricity to the grid in response to a signal from a grid operator. And my graphic on this slide is illustrative of the daily average load profiles for a grid interactive efficient building. So energy efficiency, the first chart on the left alone is pushing down the load curve, and in the middle, efficiency plus distributed generation, which in this case is solar, reduces overall use, but the building's peak load is still coincident with the utility peaks. And so then on the far right, we're adding shedding and shifting, which is flattening the load profile and also providing the greatest support to the grid. Slide 7, please. So as an example of grid interactive efficient buildings in the Southeast, I borrowed this slide from Southern Company, who in partnership with Oak Ridge and the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, and DOE, they have 2 residential grid interactive efficient building pilots. One's in Georgia, and it has grid integrated solar, storage, HVAC, water heating, and EV charging. And in Alabama, the pilot has a microgrid and grid integrated water heating and HVAC. And you can see the some of their results in that little green box in the bottom right corner, including that the homes are saving 30 to 40% more energy than comparable homes. Slide 8, please. Okay, so that was my quick background on what grid interactive efficient buildings are. And now I'm going to turn to my second topic, which is on the utility system value of demand flexibility from grid integrated interactive efficient buildings. And this is from a forthcoming report by my colleagues Tom Ekman and Lisa Schwartz and Greg Leventis, who are all at LBNL. Next slide, please. The focus of this report and the overview that I'm going to give is the utility system value of demand flexibility on the distribution and bulk system. And there's also customer and societal value streams that I'm not going to discuss today, as you can see in the bottom half of that chart. And generally speaking, grid interactive efficient buildings can provide grid services that reduce generation cost, transmission, and distribution costs, or both. Next slide, please. There's lots of benefits that buildings with demand flexibility can provide, and there'll soon be a table up that will show you many of them. And I'm not going to read all of them off, but I'll highlight a few. As I mentioned, reduced generation, transmission, and distribution costs, reduced ancillary service costs, are all some of the benefits that can be provided. And then also for the building owners and occupants, demand flexibility can provide increased resilience and the ability to integrate DERs and generally create increased satisfaction by the owner or occupant. I'm gonna keep moving along.
Next
I'm on
slide.
slide 11. Slide 11.
One more.
If anyone's following on their own. There we go. Okay, so there's many value streams that need to be considered when you're valuing demand flexibility, including the time and the location and the grid service, the expected useful life, and the avoided cost of the next least expensive resource alternative. The economic value of demand flexibility for grid services has to be established through planning processes that address these factors. And traditionally, the economic value of efficiency and demand response and other DERs has been determined by using the avoided cost of conventional resources that provide the identical utility system service. And so the underlying principle is really that the value of the resource can be estimated using the cost of acquiring the next least expensive alternative resource that provides comparable service, which is the avoided cost. And I'll say that probably again on the next slide, slide 12. So that first bullet there is, what I just said, the primary task of determining the value is looking at the avoided cost. And there's a few methods that are used to establish avoided cost, and they vary across the United States depending on the electricity market structure, the available resource options and their costs, the state energy policies and regulatory context. And in addition, some states provide detailed guidance regarding specific types of analysis, and some don't. And as a result, some jurisdictions are using market-based values and others are using resource planning processes. Some include the time-sensitive value efficiency, others include locational value. So, they're not all uniform. And that's all I wanted to say on that slide. So we can go on to slide 13. So demand flexibility should be treated on par with supply side so that all grid impacts and costs and benefits to the utility system can be quantified and monetized. And the specific approaches vary, as I mentioned, but determining the economic value of DERs providing demand flexibility generally falls within the common practices that are listed on the left side of the slide. System capacity expansion and market models, competitive bidding processes or auctions, proxy resources, and administrative or public policy determinations. And on the right side of the slide, there's two major challenges. There's limited analytical capability, and treating DERs as a resource option in capacity expansion modeling is challenging. And the limitation in capacity expansion modeling can occur for several reasons. Not all utilities or states include all system benefits, as I mentioned on the last slide, and not all utilities consistently quantify the benefits of DERs. For example, some might use marginal distribution system losses to determine the generation transmission system values, while others might be using average system losses. And the accuracy of load shape data is varied as well. So when you're considering all of these different resource options, the analysis may not take into account the interaction between DERs as well, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later on. Typical resource optimization modeling usually just embeds DERs into the load forecast, and then it won't capture the DER interactions with existing and then future resources as well. And commercially available expansion models have limited capability, except for maybe DR and battery storage. There's maybe a little bit more capability there. Slide 14, please. So our forthcoming report has 7 different enhanced valuation methods. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to cover 4 of them, which are the bolded ones in the middle. The first one is accounting for all electric utility system economic impacts resulting from demand flexibility. And then the 6th and 7th one, accounting for benefits across the full expected useful life of resources and accounting for variations in values due to interactions between DERs and other system resources, are all important, but I wanted to focus on the 4 in the middle because they're a little bit more applicable for distribution system planning. So if we can go on to slide 15, I'll start on the second enhancement, which is accounting for variations in value based on when demand flexibility occurs. So the impact of demand flexibility has to be addressed on a more granular timescale because the economic value of grid services provided varies from sub-hourly, 15 minutes, to daily, monthly, and seasonally, as well as across future years. And so the value of DER that can adjust load is fundamentally dependent on the timing of their impacts. And implementing enhancements to better account for the time-sensitive value of DERs providing demand flexibility is pretty important to establishing their value to the grid. And so that is an important valuation enhancement that we talk about in the report. And for the images, the charts that are on this slide, there's two y-axes. The left one on both charts is the megawatts, and it's dollars on the right. And these are ERCOT systems. The one on the left is from the summertime, and the one on the right is from the winter. The blue line in both of them is the ERCOT system shape, and the red line is the dollar per megawatt hour settlement price. So the blue line goes with the axis to the left, and the red line goes with the axis to the right. And then the green line in each one of these is an end-use load profile. And for the summer system, it's a residential air conditioning system, and for the winter system, it's a heat pump water heater. And as you can see, the system peaks at different times in the summer and the winter, and also there's different resources that'll line up and meet those needs in different ways. So residential air conditioning is very much on point for reducing peak and generating a lot of volume for the system in the summertime. And heat pump water heaters are, overlapping a little bit with when the system is the most, when the price is the highest at ERCOT for that particular day. But it's not as close of a fit as air conditioning is. So things change throughout the year and with different resources. Moving on to slide 16, the third enhancement is accounting for the impact of distribution system savings on transmission and generation system value. Estimates of avoided cost and the magnitude of marginal energy losses that can be avoided by deploying demand flexibility, and the value that creates is significant. So demand flexibility can reduce distribution system losses. And if you look at this chart, you move from the right side where it says if you avoid X distribution losses and you move over towards the center, then you're going to avoid Y transmission losses associated with those distribution system losses X. And then moving further to the left, the generator can avoid producing X plus Y. And then down to the bottom, there's possibly less capacity is needed to serve the X plus Y. And also there is less capacity reserve margin that is necessary. So this is a ripple effect that shows that as you move from downstream to upstream, you're going to have compounding impacts. And we'll go on to the next slide, which is the fourth valuation enhancement. This is accounting for variations in value at specific locations on the grid. And the economic value of demand flexibility that can provide grid services is very dependent on where these impacts occur on the transmission or distribution system. And this is particularly important in regions with wholesale electricity markets where market prices don't necessarily reflect distribution system locational values. Implementing enhancements to better account for locational value of savings can reveal some of the larger economic values, which is what this pie chart illustrates. So the need to account for the economic value of grid services, and the chart shows that the total value of savings from efficiency measures for residential air conditioning in California that comes from various grid services that are shown on the right side of the slide for the utilities. And as you can see, if the state only counted for energy, it would only be 20%. It's that top kind of dark blue corner of the pie chart. And nearly half of the benefits, which is the 32 plus the 14, so 46% of the benefits of the residential air conditioning savings are coming from the locational benefits on the T&D system. So actually that 14% should have a circle around it as well. Next slide, please, slide 18. This is another example of where efficiency and demand flexibility occurring influencing the value. This is a project that's in Portland. It's Portland General Electric's smart grid testbed, and they have 3 communities that are participating in this pilot, and the utilities using demand flexibility to target a capacity gap that they identified in their integrated resource plan, and they're targeting 69 megawatts of demand flexibility in the summer and 77 megawatts in the winter. And the utilities testing a wide range of technologies such as thermostats and heat pump water heaters and electric vehicle chargers and batteries. And customers that are in one of these 3 different communities were automatically enrolled in this peak time rebate program, which is what that graphic underneath the map shows. And it gives the customers the option to decide whether or not they want to change their energy use on an event by event basis. And they give them a day ahead notice, and they're earning a rebate of $1 for each kilowatt hour in reduced energy consumption that's occurring during events as compared to their baseline. And the pilot's also going to test approaches to move customers from rebates to an opt-in direct load control program. And they are also really thinking about customer value propositions with this pilot, which is pretty interesting. They're trying to figure out if customers are more interested in earning incentives or supporting renewable resources, reducing air pollution, or competing with neighbors, so like a competition to reduce peak demand, or donating credits to charities. So they have a lot of options. We will move on to the next slide, slide 19. So this is the 5th enhancement that's in the report, and this is to account for variations in value due to the interaction between DERs providing demand flexibility. So higher levels of DERs increase the need to address interactions between multiple DERs and the grid. And it's unlikely that the cumulative effect of more than one DER is just going to be additive. There's probably going to be more interaction than that. And as more demand flexibility comes online, it's going to be more important to think about how the DERs, when they're combined, are going to change the way that the impacts are resulting, and use those estimates for planning, for valuation, and also for cost effectiveness screening. The image on the right side of the slide is from a report from Berkeley Lab that the link is there for. It's on a framework for integrated analysis of distributed energy resources, and there's 3 different levels that are explored in that report around looking at a single DER, looking at multiple DERs, and then looking at multiple DERs in the electric utility system. So that's kind of a nice overview resource. If we can go on to the next slide, slide 20. This is another example, and this speaks to how failing to analyze the potential interactions between DERs can result in a less than optimal resource strategy. And this chart shows the quantity and timing of natural gas development under different levels of DER development in the Northwest Power Council's 7th Power Plan. And the x-axis of this chart is years, and the y-axis is cumulative peak capacity developed in megawatts. The red line represents the quantity of natural gas that's developed if no demand response is considered. So that was one scenario. The yellow line represents the quantity of natural gas that's developed if the acquisition of efficiency is limited to what would be cost effective using short-run market prices. And then the blue line shows the how much natural gas is developed if the acquisition of efficiency is limited to what would be cost effective to acquire based on the long-run avoided cost. So as you can see, those assumptions make quite a bit of difference in when you're going to be purchasing or installing your natural gas capacity or other resources. Slide 21, please. Okay, so this is my summary slide on the enhanced valuation methods, and the forthcoming report covers all of this in much greater detail along with a lot more information. And I'm not going to go over each one of these cells in this slide, but I do want to highlight that there's not any empty cells in this chart, and the enhancements that I discussed, in particular the variations in value based on when demand flexibility occur, which is that second row, and the valuation in the enhancement in valuation due to interactions between DERs providing demand flexibility, which is the fifth one that I talked about, are very applicable to both the distribution system planning, which is the first three columns of this chart, and generation planning, which are the next two, and transmission planning, which are the last two. Slide 22, please. So I'm going to turn to my third topic now, which is assessing demand flexibility performance of grid interactive efficient buildings. And assessments of demand flexibility determine the quantity and the quality of grid services that are provided. And without assessments, building owners and grid operators aren't going to know whether demand flexibility strategies are providing the expected benefits, and state and local governments won't have data that they need to advance demand flexibility to support their broader goals. This is also a forthcoming report from LBNL, and it was written by Steve Schiller and Sean Murphy and Lisa Schwartz, all my colleagues from Berkeley Lab. And we can go on to the next slide, slide 23. Performance assessments of demand flexibility can serve several purposes for building owners, for grid operators, state and local governments.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. As shown in this graphic on the right side of the slide, for utilities and regional grid operators, assessments can document performance with the degree of confidence that they require to treat load flexibility as a reliable resource. And assessments are critical to improving demand flexibility performance, supporting resource potential studies and electricity system planning, and evaluating cost effectiveness of demand flexibility compared to other options to meet generation and T&D needs. Slide 24, please. The forthcoming report identifies 5 fundamental considerations to define a demand flexibility assessment, which are shown here. What are the objectives of the assessment? What are the boundary? Meaning, is it a whole building or a system or equipment? What DERs are you looking at? The performance metrics, which I'll talk more about for a few slides. What metrics will be assessed and how will they be defined? Analysis methods, how will metrics be calculated and with what expectation for certainty and baselines? And then assessment implementation requirements. What are the requirements with respect to data collection, privacy, cybersecurity, and reporting? And who's conducting the assessments and what are the duration of the assessment? So next slide, please. Slide 25. So we know that measuring the impacts of demand flexibility and many resources is very important. And fortunately, it's also doable. And as I mentioned, knowing the impact of demand flexibility can help regulators and state energy officials, utilities, and grid operators so that they can rely on it as a reliable resource. But it can also help with determining settlements for event-based programs or for assessing the effectiveness of a time-varying rate structure. And building owners and occupants can improve their performance and control if they know what's happening in their building. Existing efficiency and demand responses can be used to assess demand flexibility, which helps make it doable. For example, M&V, or measurement and verification of air conditioning cycling programs, or whole building automation systems can be used to help develop demand flexibility measurement and verification or assessment. And looking forward, more sophisticated distributed energy resources may require advances in measurement and verification, but the experts that my colleagues interviewed for this did not see that as being a major barrier. And I actually want to skip to slide 27. I reversed the order when I sent my deck in. Thank you. Okay, so if you remember a few slides earlier, there was those 5 different steps to think about. And so after you determine your assessment objectives and the boundary, then you want to start thinking about your metrics, and identifying the appropriate metrics is a very important step in creating an assessment. And the metrics are numbers or forms of information that include the performance of, for this example, demand flexibility. And they can also be used to improve processes. So the metrics for demand flexibility that we talk about in the report can encompass 4 dimensions, which are shown on the slide. It's that top row of circles, and it's the quantity of demand flexibility and the quality of demand flexibility provided, impacts on non-energy building services and occupants, and then building level and disaggregated level performance. And that has 3 sub-circles underneath it, which are individual equipment, or system impacts, individual DER impacts, and individual flexibility mode impacts. So those are the category of metrics. And then if we can go back to slide 26, we provided examples of performance metrics that could be used that are tied to these grid services, because the grid services are going to help define what metrics we want to use for those assessments. Again, I won't go over all of these cells in the table in the interest of time, but for example, efficiency, which is that bottom row, and load shedding and shifting, which are the top two rows. The primary quantity metrics for assessing demand flexibility might be defined as changes in the power draw, or demand, or kW, and consumption, so energy, or kWh, of a building compared to what the baseline of that building was, and or the baseline being the business as usual scenario. And in the future, things may change and we may not need baselines, but that's how we're thinking about it now. Slide 28, please. Okay, so to wrap up this section, I have 5 actions that states can take to advance demand flexibility assessments. First, states can encourage performance assessments and share those results. They could use public buildings as an example, but requiring demand flexibility assessments for buildings that they're owning or managing. States can incorporate best assessment practices for performance metrics, analysis methods, baselines, and implementation approaches in their own programs. They can support advances in assessment practices, including performance metrics, assessment strategies, and implementation. They can improve data access from existing utility billing to customers and whomever those customers may wish to share their information with through data access provisions such as AMI, or through encouraging sub-metering through building automation systems, and then also standards and protocols. So slide 29, please. Okay, on to my 4th topic. This last section is going to talk about opportunities for states to advance demand flexibility, and I wanted to run our second poll question now. While we're running this poll question, I'm going to tell a funny story. I live in a relatively rural area of Ohio, and last spring I had a robin that showed up and started tapping on my window throughout the day and followed me all over the house and tapped on the window wherever I was standing. And he's back this year, and I now have a dog, and he's making the dog crazy. And I'm very excited that neither one of them have been tapping on the windows or barking during this presentation. So that was my funny story. So I don't know where we're at with polling.
That bird seems to be haunting you, Natalie.
I know.
All right, we'll give people one more second to submit their response. I think this one just might take a little bit more thinking, so we're just going to give it another second. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now.
Okay, so let's see. We have people most thinking about shaping efficiency or demand response programs, so that's great. And if we can go on to slide 30, it seems like many of you agree with this first statement, since you voted on a few of them, that demand flexibility can help meet multiple state goals. Some of the ones that weren't listed on the slide are reliability and resilience, and energy affordability. Demand flexibility can address other grid challenges and reduce stress on the grid. They can provide higher value than traditional grid solutions with additional benefits for both consumers and society. They can improve building performance through improved equipment functionality and performance. We can go on to the next slide. So the next 2 slides I have are groupings of actions that states and utilities can take to advance demand flexibility. And the first grouping is to gather information and identify opportunities. The second one is to develop and implement strategies to integrate demand flexibility. And the third one on the next slide, which I'll talk about in a second, is on accelerating adoption. So for each of these categories, we have actions for state and local governments, utility regulators, and utilities. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all of these cells, but I just wanted to highlight for a few of them. So for the first category, gathering information and identifying opportunities, states can identify goals that demand flexibility can support, and regulators can work with stakeholders and utilities to identify opportunities to use demand flexibility and efficiency programs, such as, how many of you responded in the poll. And in the second category, utility regulators can enable incentives and rate designs that align customers and grid needs and facilitate the use of demand flexibility. And utilities can test out those rate designs in pilots or other approaches. If we can go on to the next slide, that's that third category on accelerating adoption. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but utility regulators can provide guidance for enhanced valuation methods, and utilities can implement to help accelerate the adoption of demand flexibility. State and local governments can assess and report on progress made on their demand flexibility as, perhaps part of a benchmarking activity or something along those lines. We can go on to the next slide. So in addition to all of the opportunities that I just gave, states can also participate in the NASIO-NARUC Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group, which is an ongoing working group that has 14 states in it, maybe a few more than that right now. And it is Department of Energy funded, and they have provided funding to national labs to provide direct technical assistance to the states in the working group to help them identify opportunities to advance demand flexibility. We're currently identifying topics for the technical assistance, which right now we've slimmed it down to advancing publicly owned grid interactive efficient buildings, quantifying the potential for grid interactive efficient buildings, improving valuation, which was that second topic that I talked about, and also grid interactive efficient building pilots, which is a great segue to my next slide, which is slide 34. In addition to the working group, which you can still join if you're interested in, please let me know. DOE is also offering $42 million in funding. They have announced their notice of intent to fund this Connected Communities project, which is really grid interactive efficient buildings pilot. And the project will demonstrate and evaluate the capacity of buildings as grid assets by flexing load in new and existing communities in diverse climates, geography, building type, and regulatory structure. And if you'd like more funding, more information on the funding opportunity announcement when it comes out, there's some details on the next slide, which is slide 35. I think the DOE is anticipating releasing the funding opportunity announcement in the next maybe week or two. And if you want more information on that, you can go to this link or scan the QR code. And again, they're looking for projects that are going to be willing to share their data and diverse and looking at multiple buildings with multiple DERs. Okay, so my next slide is just a slide of resources that are available to some of the lab resources that are focused on grid interactive efficient buildings. And then my slide after that is my last one. And it has my contact info, so please let me know if you're interested in the Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings working group or any of this other material. And I will pause there. We have 4 minutes left for questions.
All right. Thanks, Natalie. That was terrific. And we're going to end here in 4 minutes, and I'm going to give Carrie maybe 2 of those minutes. But Carrie, can you go back to slide 3 in Natalie's presentation? We had a technical glitch earlier, and we weren't able to show that slide. And I just want to point out that Natalie and I were really pleased to see the wide range of regulatory proceedings, legislation, and that Southeast states have related to demand flexibility, whether there are ways to improve demand flexibility through storage and demand response, increasing the need for demand flexibility, are things like transportation electrification initiatives and existing targets for renewables and community solar. And so and also trying to understand the value of distributed resources in several states. And then, of course, there are existing energy efficiency requirements that are already contributing to peak load reduction in really most Southeast states. So I just wanted to share that with you, that there's a lot going on in the Southeast related to this demand flexibility topic. All right, I think that's it. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn this back to Carrie for final remarks for today.